Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 9 articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express, especially from the perspective of the upcoming civil services mains exam. In the first article, we'll talk about the need and importance of female labor participation. In the second article, we'll talk about the increasing tendency by the government to resort to internet shutdowns. In the third article, we'll talk about the need to revamp the textiles and the garment sector in the country. In the fourth article, we'll talk about one of the very important intellectual property rights, that is patents. In the fifth article, we'll talk about the very important Indian Agriculture Research Institute. Finally, in the Prelims Snippets section, we'll have a look at some of the very important topics for the preliminary exam. Now, the very first article deals with the female employment. Now, we all know that when it comes to the female labor force participation rate in India, it is quite dismal when compared to the world average. However, this article in particular points toward a bright picture. It says that there has been an increasing trend in the female labor force participation rate with special emphasis to the rural India during the period 2018-22, right? Now, this gives us the opportunity to realize the potential of the female labor force in the overall economic setup of the country, right? So this is with respect to GS2, social sector, women, and GS3, inclusive growth. Now, let's first talk about what is labor force participation rate, right? So it is the percentage of the population engaged in the labor. That is the people who are working or who are actively seeking the work, right? So when we talk about the data with respect to the labor force participation rate is primarily gathered through the periodic labor force survey. Now, this is conducted by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now, if you just see the graph, you can see that the labor force participation rate in the country in the year 2022 was 55.2%, right? And it was 50.2% when we look at the numbers of 2019, right? So that is what we can have a general picture with respect to the labor force participation rate. Now, when we talk about the females in particular, what we see is that there has been, as I just talked in the beginning, that there has been an increasing trend, right? So the female labor force participation rate, when we talk about India, it has increased from 24.6% to 36.6% from the year 2018 to 22. That is, there has been a 12% increase, right? Now, but what we can see is that still the overall female labor force participation rate in India, it is 32.8%. It is 32.8%. Now, this is very less when compared to the world average. So you can see that the world average, that is the female labor force participation rate, was 53.4% in the year 2019. But the same number in India, it was 24.5%, right? So it is quite dismal. Now, what is the reason for this? The primary reason for this is that maximum of the women, they are primarily engaged in the unpaid family labor work. That is, that they are not even paid for it, right? So while it is 9.3% of the males who are engaged in the unpaid family labor work, the same number is 36.5% for the women in the country, right? So that is something which we need to think about. Now, what it points towards the fact is that there is a great opportunity for tapping the female participation in the labor force, right? So you can also see in the graph below that there has been an increase. There has been an increase when it comes to the rural female labor force participation rate. That is, it has increased from this number, that is 24.6% to 36.6% in the year 2022, right? Now, let's talk about what are the factors which are responsible for the low female labor participation in India. The first is the social norms. So let's first talk about what are social norms. See, social norms are the informal rules of behavior. That is, what is acceptable in a society and what is not acceptable in a society. So the social norms in India are such that women are seen as the homemaker, the ideal homemaker, whereas the men are seen as the breadwinner of the family, right? So here, this contrast is the result that it leads to that the women are unable to integrate in the labor market, right? Next is the unpaid care work. Now, if you also look at the graph, it can tell you, now this graph is provided by the PLFS. Now it says that almost 3.4% women, they are outside the labor force because of social reasons, right? So this is what the social norms is. Next is the unpaid care work. Now, one of the greatest problem with married women in the country is the time poverty. That is, they are occupied in domestic chores and they're not even paid for it, right? So that is what leads to their sort of disintegration from the labor market. So you can see in this figure that almost 44.5% of the women, they are unable to join the labor force because of the childcare or personal commitments, right? Now, talking about the gender biased norms, the social setup in the country is such that there are deep gender biased norms. For example, some of the companies in India, they don't allow women to work on the night shift, right? Also, according to a UNDP survey, United Nations Development Program survey, it did a survey and it pointed out that almost 92% of the people said that it is normal that if women are having sort of facing the intimate partner violence, right? So they had no problem with that. So that is the kind of social setup which we have. Next is the caste discrimination. The issue is that once you see that the women from the lower castes, they are having high female labor participation, especially in those sectors which are informal, right? So what it does is that it limits their social mobility, right? Next is salary wage disparity. What we find is that there is a deep disparity. There is a disparity when it comes to there's a disparity with respect to the pay between men and women. For the same work, the men are paid higher than the women. For example, for a regular work, a man in India, he earns almost 28% more than a woman. For a casual work, a man in India almost earns 48% more than a woman, right? So that is a disparity in terms of the pay, right? Next is educational levels. Now see, what we actually observe is that as the educational attainments of the women increase, there is an increase in their labor force participation, right? So you can also see in this map that as we have got women who are not literate, and then the literacy keeps on increasing. So over here you have secondary, then you have higher secondary, then graduate, postgraduate. So you can see the labor force is increasing. Now this points towards the fact, two things, that as the educational attainments increase, the labor force participation also increase. And what we need to keep in mind is that we need to give impetus to the educational attainment of the women in particular, right? So these are some of the factors which are responsible for low female labor participation. Now coming to how does the higher female employment impacts the society? See, the first is economic growth. If you have higher female labor force participation, obviously it would increase the economic growth, right? Because see, just assume that if you have a substantial chunk of women who are outside the labor force, that is actually leading to a loss of potential income to the country as a whole, right? So there needs to be a policy framework where these women are encouraged to join the labor force, so that the overall economy of the country can increase at a sustainable pace. Next is poverty reduction. Now this is but obvious that if you have women who are adequately a part of the labor force and they are a part of the income generating sort of jobs, if they have such kind of jobs, then obviously it would lead to sort of the decrease in the poverty levels. Also, it would enhance the standard of living, right? Next is human capital development. It has been observed through various studies that those women who are engaged in productive employment opportunities, their children, they fare better when it comes to the health and educational indices, right? So those women who are already a part of the workforce, the health and education parameters of their children they fare better than the ones who are not working in the labor force, right? Who are not a part of the labor force. Next is gender equality and empowerment. Now this is but obvious that once you have women in the labor force, it actually increases their bargaining power, right? It increases their bargaining power and they have a good decision-making power in the household. And that leads to a gender equality and also their empowerment in the overall social setup, right? Next is fertility and population growth. It has been observed through various studies that as there is an increase in the female labor force participation, there is a decrease in the total fertility rate. Now this fertility transition, it is associated with increased sort of standards when it comes to the health and education of every member in the family, right? So it's not just the women, but also even other family members, they also have better standard of life, right? Next is reduce gender-based violence. Also, it has been observed that when women are employed, they are in a better capacity to protect themselves, right? And they obviously then have a greater voice when it comes to telling about that the violence committed against them, right? Next is labor market and talent pool. Now, this is but obvious that if you have greater number of women in the labor force, it would enhance the talent pool, right? It would lead to a optimal utilization of the resource base. Here we are talking about the human resource base, right? So these are some of the benefits. These are some of the impacts of having a good female labor force participation rate, right? Now, let's talk about the government initiatives which are there to enhance, to improve the female labor force participation rate in India. The first is the Code on Social Security and the Code on Wages. See, please understand that we have got the 4 labor codes which would soon be implemented. Now, one of the labor codes is Code on Social Security. Now, this has a lot of provisions. For example, it talks about mandatory maternity benefit of around 26 weeks to women, then also creche facilities in the establishment having more than 50 employees, and also having the facilities with respect to insurance scheme for women, right? Next is Code on Wages. Now, this has provisions which talks about that there should not be any kind of activity by any enterprise which leads to a pay disparity between men and women for the same kind of job, right? So it has provisions with respect to that. Next is Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao. Now, this scheme, it was launched by the government and it primarily guarantees the survival, the women's safety and educational attainment of women, right? Next is the prevention of sexual harassment of women. So this act, it actually provides protection to women against sexual harassment and also gives a grievance redressal mechanism, right? Next is a Working Women Hostel Scheme. So the government has implemented the scheme where the government is providing subsidies for making sure that there are adequate funds available for the construction or the expansion of facilities with respect to the women hostels in towns and cities, right? Next is One Stop Center and the universalization of Women Helpline. Now, these are meant to provide help to women in emergency situations, to help women if they are facing violence, to help women if they are in the condition of distress, right? So that is in terms of the emergency situations. Next is skilling initiatives. There have been a lot of programs by the government where the government is actually emphasizing on enhancing the skill base of the females in India. For example, we have got the Women Industrial Training Institutes, or we have got the National Vocational Training Institutes, right? Next is the Manrega. So we have got the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which mandates that 1/3 of the jobs through the Manrega shall be given to the women in particular, right? So these are some of the initiatives which are taken by the government. Next, what should be the way forward? What should be the way forward when it comes to increasing the female labor force participation in India? The first is improve access to quality education. Now, this is very important. We need to make sure that all women, irrespective of their economic or social background, they are given adequate opportunities, adequate educational opportunities. So we already saw that as the education levels improve, there is an improvement in the labor force participation rate. So that is very much needed. Next is combating caste discrimination. Now, this is very much important. How can the government do this? Through affirmative policies, through making sure that the women from the lower caste, they have the ability to have the social mobility, right? So they also need to have the social mobility. So there needs to be those policies in place which make sure that there is no discrimination when it comes to the employment opportunities. Next is role of self-help group in women empowerment. Now, we all know that the self-help group movement in India, it has played a very big role when it comes to the formalization of the women enterprises, or let's say the adequate credit disbursal to these women who want to start their own livelihood options. So that should be enhanced. For example, we have got Seva, right? So the Seva model can be incorporated. Next is addressing the structural rigidities. See, we need to make sure that these rigidities are done away with. For example, we need to make sure that women are not barred from working in the night shift, right? They also have the equal opportunity. So there needs to be adequate protection facilities, safety facilities, and women should be allowed to work in the night shifts. Next, what we can do is that there is a need to give impetus to the formalization of the informal sector, right? So that the women also have got adequate social security benefits. Next is vocational training. Now, this we have been talking about. Even the National Education Policy of 2020 talks about integrating the vocational education aspect to the mainstream education, right? So that is very much important. Then promoting the gender neutral social norms. This is the final word, that there needs to be a voice from the top. That is, there has to be, people should talk about this issue, right? There needs to be a community awareness. people should talk about that. Yes, there needs to be equality when it comes to these opportunities for the women, right? Also, what we can use is that we can have role models. For example, we have got the Honorable Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, or we have got the ex-IPS officer Kiran Bedi, or we have got the recently elected the member of the parliament in the Rajya Sabha, Sudha Murthy, right? So they can actually be sort of, their words can help a lot of women. It can give motivation to a lot of women, and then they can join the workforce, right? So what we see is that there is a need of a multi-pronged approach. There are issues with respect to the female labor force participation in India. There is a need of a multi-pronged approach so that we can inclusive growth. And on the other hand, we can ensure that we have a sustainable economic growth, a fast and sustainable economic growth, right? So before we go to the next topic, we have a mains question. So the question says, the current increasing trend in the female labor force participation rate, especially in the rural India, indicates an untapped opportunity for female employment generation. Discuss. So do write an answer and post in the comment section. Now the next article is with respect to the internet shutdowns in India. Now we have seen that there has been a growing tendency where the government is resorting to the internet shutdowns, citing the public safety concerns, right? So even recently, what we have seen is that the Haryana government has imposed a sort of internet shutdown in a particular district, citing the public safety concern, right? So we'll see what internet shutdown is all about, what are the arguments in favor, what are the arguments against it, and what should be the way forward. Now, this is with respect to GS2, fundamental rights, government policies, and interventions. Now, what are internet shutdowns, right? So internet shutdowns are nothing but they are deliberate disruptions of the internet or the electronic communications, which actually render the internet services inaccessible, right? Or which people are unable to use these services. Now, these internet shutdowns can be for a specific population or for a specific location, right? And they basically exert control over the flow of information. So it is the flow of information which is targeted by the authorities, right? So their main aim is to restrict the flow of the information. Now, what are the provisions? Now, before we talk about the provisions, we should also have a look at the data. So we have a report by Keep It On. Now, it says that in the year 2022, the total number of internet shutdowns around the world, it was 187, right? And it was India, out of these total number of internet shutdowns, India had 84 of them, right? So India is one of the countries which imposes one of the highest number of internet shutdowns, right? And you can also see that we have the report by the same organization, and it says that the number of URL blocking per year. Now, in the year 2018, it was around 2,800, and it has gone to around 6,775 in the year 2022. Now, these are done under the provisions of the Section 69A of the Information Technology Act. Now, this Section 69A, it empowers the government to block certain website or some content if it thinks that it is sort of affecting the public safety, right? So that is what Section 69A is all about. Now, what are the provisions which enable the government to impose such shutdowns? So we have got Section 5 subclause 2 of the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885. Now this read with, along with the temporary suspension of telecom services, public emergency and public safety rules of 2017. Now this empower the Union Home Secretary or the State Home Secretary to order the suspension of these telegraphic services, which includes the internet also, right? Now, such in an urgent situation, even the officer of a rank of Joint Secretary or above can take such measures with the permission of the Union Home Secretary or the State Home Secretary, right? Now, these rules also say that such order passed by the Union or State Home Secretary, it must be reviewed within 5 days and it cannot last for more than 15 days, right? Next, we have Section 144 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, this empowers the district magistrate or the sub-divisional magistrate or the executive magistrate empowered by the state government to impose those restrictions which might lead to public safety, right? Or which might prevent the public nuisance, right? Now, this also includes the suspension of the internet, right? So through these two measures, there is the suspension of the internet, right? Now, what are the arguments regarding the internet shutdowns? So the arguments in favor are, so it helps prevent the spread of hate speech and fake news, which could incite violence or riots in some part of the country. I hope you remember that the government of India, it imposed the internet shutdown in the NCR region when there were sort of farmers' protests on the Republic Day, right? Also, it helps to curb the organization and mobilization of protests. which could disturb the public safety, which could disturb the public peace, right? For example, when the Article 370 was abrogated, there were internet shutdowns in Jammu Kashmir, right? Next, it helps protect the national security and sovereignty from external threats, right, or from cyber attacks. So you must be aware that when we had a border standoff at the Galban or the Doklam with China, we had some of the areas at the borders where internet shutdown was actually imposed, right? So that there can be a sort of peace at the borders, right? Now, next is it helps control the distribution and the consumption of content, which some people might find offensive or disturbing, right? So, in order to make sure that such people, people are safe and they do not get disturbed by such content, there is sometimes the internet shutdown. Now, what are the arguments against it? First is that it undermines democracy and accountability. How? That once you have got these internet shutdowns in place, what happens is that it restricts the access to the information. People are unable to take part in the debates, right? They are unable to hold the government accountable. Next is it enables the authoritarian governments to silence the critics. And once you have got these shutdowns in place, it restricts the real information. It leads to a more distorted narrative, right? Misinformation. Next is they are ineffective and counterproductive. See, the reason is that they are not addressing the root cause. They're just having a short-term measure. It's just a short-term measure where it's just leading to the resentment among the people, right? It is fueling the anger. And on the other hand, what it is leading to is information vacuum, where the government is also not providing the adequate information and where the other information sources are also blocked. Next is they're arbitrary and prone to abuse. What do you mean by this? See, whenever these restrictions are imposed, due process is not followed and there is arbitrariness in this. Moreover, the judicial scrutiny is not at that particular moment. It takes years and then judiciary takes a particular action. So what we see is that it is an executive action and most of the times there is arbitrariness which is involved. Now, what are the impacts of the internet shutdown in the country? First is that it leads to the violation of fundamental rights. How? See, it was the case of Anuradha Basin versus Union of India in the year 2020, where the Supreme Court very clearly said that internet shutdowns in the country, they violate Article 19 subclause 1 subclause A, that is a right to freedom of speech and expression, and Article 19 subclause 1 subclause E, that is right to carry out any trade or profession, right? So in the case of Anuradha Basin versus Union of India in the year 2020. Next, it also violates the right to information. Now, this is a fundamental right and it was declared a fundamental right in the year 1975 in the Raj Narayan versus Union of India case, right? Next, the internet shutdown also violate the right to access internet. Now, this was declared a fundamental right under Article 21, that is the right to life and personal liberty in the Fahim Shireen versus State of Kerala, right? Next is what are the economic consequences? So there are huge economic consequences. Those businesses which are engaged, which carry out their trade or profession in using the internet or the operations and management or their sale, they suffer a lot when internet shutdown is actually imposed. For example, according to the top 10 VPN, we have in the year 2023 almost more than 2091 crores. It was lost because of the internet shutdowns. Next is the disruption of education. So there are many educational institutes which provide the educational services through the internet. So once you have got internet shutdown, it restricts the ability of the students to access the internet and then it affects their educational attainment also. Next, impediment to disaster response. So once you have got the internet shutdowns in place, it actually leads to coordination issues. So there is lack of coordination among people. And also according to the United Nations, it has said that internet shutdowns affect the public safety and well-being, right? Next, trust and censorship concerns. So what happens is that once you have got the government frequently imposing such shutdowns, it leads to trust deficits. It leads to the erosion of trust in the eyes of people, right? Next, international repercussions. So what we see is that when you have such internet shutdowns being imposed by the government again and again, it damages the credibility of that particular country. Moreover, when we are a democratic polity, right? So in a democratic setup, if we are again and again using such measures, so it affects India's stature, right? Next is impact on journalism and reporting. Now, this is very important. So we have got different journalists who access the internet for getting any information or spreading a particular public news. So we also know that freedom of press, it was declared a fundamental right in the Indian Express versus Union of India in 1986, or Bennett Coleman versus Union of India, right? So through these cases, freedom of press was declared a fundamental right. But what we see is that once you have the internet shutdowns in place, it affects the journalist. So what should be the way forward? First is that there is a need to strengthen the existing framework. See, we are still relying on the Telegraph Act of 1885. There is a need to amend to make sure that the act is in lines with the present times, and make sure that internet shutdown should be used as a last resort, not as a first approach. Next is ensure the accountability of the authorities. Now this becomes very important. If you have got the authorities who are taking such actions, it need to be make sure that such authorities are accountable. They're accountable for their actions. Next, exercise alternate options. We should not use internet shutdowns as a first measure. What we can do is we can block that particular website, we can block that particular content, or we can take the help of the civil society organizations, right? We can create more awareness. Then we need to adhere to the Supreme Court guidelines. So as I told in the beginning, that in the case of Anuradha Basin versus Union of India in the year 2020, Supreme Court issued 3 guidelines. First, it said that there needs to be a sort of proportionality, so that what it means is that if you are imposing internet shutdown, it should be proportional, right? Next, it should be of temporary nature and not of permanent nature. Finally, what Supreme Court said was that it is subject to judicial review. The internet shutdowns in the country are subject to judicial review. So what we see is that in a democratic polity, obviously, internet shutdowns are not something which is very good. It needs to be sort of weakened to the most possible extent, and we need to make sure that obviously as citizens we are more aware that we do not spread misinformation or disinformation, right? So that is what adopting such techniques, we can make sure that we have a polity where we respect the freedom of speech and expression, and the government also needs to realize that it should not resort to such actions again and again. Now, before we go to the another topic, we have a main question. So the question says, internet shutdowns in India should strive to balance the maintenance of public order and safeguarding the individual liberties. Explain. So do write an answer and post in the comment section. So the next article is with respect to the textiles and the garments. So this piece of article in the Hindu, it tells us about the fact that the exports, the garment exports around the world from India, they're facing the stagnancy issue. That is, even if we compare with 2013 and 14, the exports of garments has been stagnant. So it was just $14.5 billion in the year 2023-24, and it was around $15 billion in 2013-14. Now this is with respect to GS3 Indian economy. Now first, let's talk about the textile sector in the general. So it is a labor intensive sector which employs almost second highest number of people after the agriculture sector, right? And what we need to keep in mind is that it is one of the oldest industries in the Indian economy, and thus it has carried on the legacy when it comes to the cultural aspects, when it comes to the handicrafts, when it comes to the different techniques to manufacture a particular textiles. So you can see that it employs over 45 million people, and it contributes to almost 12% to India's export earnings. Now this can be divided into two sort of sectors. Now the first is the unorganized sector. Now this deals with the traditional machinery, right? So we have got the handlooms, we have got the handicrafts, right? Then we have got the organized sector. Now this includes the modern machinery, and it includes the power looms, etc. Next, it contributes to around 2.3% to the India's GDP, and as I said, that it contributes to around 12% to India's overall export earnings. India is the 6th largest producer of technical textiles. Now, what are technical textiles? See, these are functional fabrics, right? And these have varied application in specific domains. For example, civil engineering or structural engineering, right? So there we use the textiles, technical textiles. Now you can just see the share of India's textile exports in the financial year 24. So you can have the ready-made garments of all textile, right? So it has the highest share of 42.4%. Then you have got the other types. So fabric production in the year financial year 24, we have got the cotton yarn highest at 952. Then you have got the blended 100% non-cotton yarn, which is at 432. So similarly, you can have a look at the other components also. So now, what are the challenges with respect to the textile sector in India? The first is that it is highly fragmented. That is, it is dominated by the small players. It is dominated by the unorganized sector. The sector is not formalized, right? Next is that there is outdated technology. The sector even today, it is mostly dependent on the obsolete technology. Now, this compromises on the efficiency part, on the productivity part. Next is the tax structure issues. So there has been a concern from the industry side that the tax structure on the textiles is such that it is affecting the domestic production as well as the international exports. So the taxes are much, even after the imposition of the GST, even after the starting of the GST, what we see is that the tax structure is not suitable for the textile sector. Next, the stagnant exports. So if you just see in this image, what you see is that the textile export, it was around $37 billion in financial year 18, and it is just stagnated. In fact, it is decreasing, right? So there is stagnation in the exports, and that is what we are talking about in this particular article itself, that we are not witnessing a growth trajectory when it comes to the exports of textiles, and it is instead being taken by, the space is being taken by Vietnam and Bangladesh, right? Next is lack of scale. So what we see is that the industries in India, on an average, they employ around 100 machines per factory. Whereas the industries in Bangladesh or Vietnam, they have almost 500 machines per industry. So over there, you have the economy of scale, which obviously reduces the total amount, the cost of the production, right? Next is lack of foreign investment. Owing to all these factors, what we see is that the foreign investors, they're not enthusiastic enough to invest in the Indian textile industry, right? Now, what have been the major initiatives? First is the amended technology upgradation fund scheme. Now, it was launched in the year 2015 to upgrade the technical aspect, to make it more technologically intensive, right? Next is the scheme for integrated textile parks, SITP. Now, this primarily aimed to use the economies of agglomeration, to clusterize different sort of setups, the textile setups, and make sure that they actually use the economies of scale and economies of agglomeration. Next is the Samarth scheme. Now, this scheme is primarily the scheme for enhancing or building the capacity building in the textile sector. Now, it primarily aimed at enhancing the capacity building of the manufacturers in the textile sector. And it is also known as Samarth scheme. Next is the Northeast Region Textile Promotion Scheme. This primarily focuses upon increasing the textile production in the Northeast region. Now, it aims to provide subsidies for different sort of activities in the textile sector. Next is the PowerTex India. It primarily aims to make sure that the power textiles are adequately funded. They are given adequate subsidies so that they can increase their productivity and efficiency. Next is Jute Eye Care. So this stands for Jute Intensive Care and Retting Exercises. Now, this primarily aims to support the jute cultivators and make sure that they enhance their production. Next, the National Technical Textile Mission. Now, this aims to make India as a global leader in the production of the technical textiles. So these are some of the schemes which the government has launched. What should be the way forward? The first is innovations and latest technology. Now, this is very much needed. What we are seeing is that there is a lot of obsolete technologies still which we are using in the textile sector. So what we need to do is that there needs to be an enhancement in the technical sort of machines, in the technological intensification of these production units. Next is mega apparel parks and the common infrastructure. So as I said, that there is a need to exploit the economies of scale and economies of agglomeration. So there is a need to clusterize these sort of production units so that they can reap the benefits from each other. Next is mission mode for textile sector. So there is a need for a comprehensive scheme which runs on a mission mode, and it leads to the overhaul of the textile sector in general, right? So what we see is definitely there are issues, and that is the reason that what you're witnessing is the exports are not matching to the expectations. Thus, we need a sort of a multi-pronged approach and make sure that yes, the textile sector, which provides employment to a lot of people, it has a sort of a sustainable growth, and it can be a sort of more productive and efficient. Now, before we go to the next topic, we have a mains question. So the question says the textile sector in India is not only one of the largest generators of employment, but also has the potential to become one of the pillars of export-led growth. So please elaborate and write an answer on this. So the next article is with respect to the patents. So we have a recent report which talks about the fact that the number of Indian patent applicants, it has for the first time, it has outpaced that of the foreign applicants. You can just see in this image that the number of the Indian patent applicants, it has crossed the sort of foreign applicants for the first time, and the percentage of the foreign applicants, it has come below the 50%, right? However, what we see is that still it is the foreign applicants who have been granted the majority of the patents, that is almost more 70%, that is to be exact 72%. So we have got the Indian patentee, that is very less, almost 28%, and then we have got the foreign patentee, which is almost 72%, right? So this becomes important, this topic becomes important, and we need to explore what patents are all about. So if we talk about patents, so patent is a type of an intellectual property right. Now this is a statutory right for an invention which is granted for a specific time period to that particular patentee, right? And it in exchange for the full disclosure of his information, right? And the other persons, they are excluded. Anyone else apart from that particular person is excluded to use that particular product which is patented or the process which is patented without the consent of the person who is holding the patent, right? So that is what the patent is all about. Now, the patent system in India, it is primarily regulated through the Indian Patents Act of 1970. In 2005, we had some amendments to this particular act. And then we have got the patent rules, which are frequently published by the government according to the needs of the time. Now, what are the criteria for patentability? The first is that it should be novel. Now, this is in accordance to the Indian Patents Act. Novel means that a genuine, a new innovation. Next is it should have an inventive step or it must be non-obvious. Next, it should be capable of industrial application. Next, it should not attract the provisions of Section 3 and Section 4 of the Patents Act of 1970. So the Section 3 of the Patents Act of 1970, it talks about what are not inventions, right? Then Section 4, it talks about that the nuclear inventions in the nuclear policy or in the nuclear area, they are not patentable, right? So this is what Section 4 talks about. Now, what is a term for a patent? See, generally the patents are granted for a period of 20 years from the date of filing that particular application. However, we also have the Patent Cooperation Treaty. Now, this is an international treaty, right? So what it does is, so we have got the term of the patent is also 20 years, but from the date of the international filing. So whenever you have got the international filing, from there we have got the counting starts of the 20 years from that particular day, right? Now in India, the Indian Patent Office, it is governed by the Controller General of Patent, Design and Trademarks. Now this is under the overall jurisdiction of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now this becomes very important for your prelims exam, right? Now the National Intellectual Property Rights Policy, it was launched in the year 2016 and it gave a call for a creative India and an innovative India. Now this policy, the aim of the policy is to set up a proper institutional mechanism for monitoring review of the patent structure in the country, right? And making sure that the intellectual property rights, they are used in the best possible way for the the benefit of the society at large, right? So this is what you need to know about the patents. Now the next article is with respect to the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. So we have a particular data from the Indian Express in this article, which says that almost 90% of the basmati rice variety which India exported in the year 2023-24, it was actually developed by the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. So this institute becomes really important. Now this is with respect to GS3 agriculture and exports. Now, if you talk about the Indian Agriculture Research Institute, it serves as the India's largest and foremost institute in the field of agriculture sciences, right? It also includes the sort of horticulture crops and other things, right? Next, it is situated in Delhi and it is administered by the Indian Council for Agriculture Research. Now, you must be aware that the Minister for Agriculture, he acts as the president for the Indian Council for Agriculture Research. Now, this is popularly known as the Pusa Institute because it was in the year 1905 and it was started in a place Pusa in Bihar, right? That's the reason it is known as Pusa Institute. Next, we also must be aware that it was a philanthropist, Mr. Henry Phipps, because of whom he gave a lot of amount to the government at that time, and it led to the institutionalization of the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. Now, it was in the year 1919 that it was named as the Imperial Agriculture Research Institute. However, what we saw was that in the year 1934, there was a devastating earthquake, and then it was shifted to Delhi, right? Now, post-independence, its name was changed and the imperial word was replaced by the Indian. So it is now the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. Now, what is the mandate of the Indian Agriculture Research Institute? First is to provide the basic, strategic and anticipatory research in agriculture sciences, including the horticulture crops, so that there is an enhancement in the productivity, in the efficiency of the crops. Next is the integrated crop management technologies. It works upon developing those technologies which can have a positive impact on the sustainable agriculture management systems, right? Next, it also serves as the Center for Academic Excellence, as it provides the opportunities with respect to the postgraduate courses in agriculture sciences, also some of the courses with respect to the human resource development. Next, it also provides the national leadership in agriculture research, making sure that the agriculture production in the country, it increases sustainably. Now, what we need to keep in mind is that it's a deemed university and it was declared in the year 1958, and IARI has played a very important role. Now, we all know the contributions made by Mr. M.S. Swaminathan. So what we see is that IARI was the pioneering institution when it comes to enhancing the overall food basket for the country, right? And it played one of the most important role when it comes to the green revolution in India. So that is what you need to know about the IARI, that is Indian Agriculture Research Institute. So coming to the Prelims Snippets section, we have got the first article as the World Intellectual Property Organization. Now, this is a specialized agency of the United Nations, and all member states of the United Nations are entitled, though they are not obliged, to become members of this particular specialized organization like WIPO. Now, India joined the World Intellectual Property Organization in the year 1975. Now, you must be aware, and this is very important, that it is the WIPO in association with the other institution, for example, the Cornell University and the INSEAD, with the help of which it actually publishes the Global Innovation Index. Very important. It's very important for your prelims exam, right? Now, this is an annual ranking for countries on their capacity for and their successes in innovation. Now, what are the functions of the World Intellectual Property Organization? First is that it is a policy forum to shape balanced international intellectual property rules, right? So it is here that we have got the sessions with respect to what the structure or what the architecture with respect to the intellectual property right should be. Next, it provides global services to protect the intellectual property and to resolve disputes among different member states. Then it also provides the technical infrastructure to connect the IP systems and share knowledge. So it has got proper computational systems in place where the different countries interact among each other and get to know that which of the things are patented or which of the things have copyright, right? Next, it also focuses upon the cooperation and capacity building program in different countries. A world reference source for IP information is also provided by the World Intellectual Property Organization. So this is what you need to keep in mind. Now, the next topic is with respect to the BRICS. Now, we all know that the BRICS has expanded and it has included new members. For example, we have UAE, for example, we have Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, right? So therefore, it becomes very important. And the membership has started from the 1st January 2024. Now, if we go into the inception of this particular organization, what we see is that initially it was a British economist, Jim O'Neill, who particularly coined this term, BRIC, right, in reference to the future of the emerging economies around the world, including India, China, right? So what we see is that it was in the year 2009 that we had the first summit of the BRICS, and it was in Yekaterinburg in Russia. Then after a year, we had a summit where South Africa was invited, and ultimately BRIC became BRICS, right? So this is what you need to keep in mind. Now, if you talk about the enlarged group, now at present comprising the population of all the countries who are the part of the BRICS, it has 3.5 billion people, almost more than 45% of the global population. It collectively, the economies of its member exceed 28.5 trillion, that is around 28% of the global economy, right? Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE collectively contribute to approximately 44% of the global crude oil production. So this is what the importance is. Now, this becomes important for India because we all know that India is a very big importer of crude oil from around the world. And once we have got these countries on board, it will give a nice mechanism, a good mechanism, a platform where India can effectively deal with these countries. This is what you need to know about BRICS. Now, next is with respect to a mapping. Now, this is in reference to the dispute between the Philippines and China. Here, the South China Sea becomes important because you have a lot of claims by different countries. For example, if you just look at this map, we have got the 9-dash line. So you can see if you look at this map, you have got the 9-dash line. So the area including the 9-dash line is being claimed by China. Obviously, that is not actually taken in a good light by the other countries because other countries also have their claims. So if you just have a look here, that the Philippines have a claim with respect to that. You can just see with this map, the orange, and then you have got the Vietnamese claim, then you have got the Malaysian claim. Different countries are claiming a particular part of the South China Sea, and the largest being claimed by the China. Now, some areas become really important. So you have got the Gulf of Tonkin here, right? Then you have got the Scarborough Shoal. Now, this Scarborough Shoal, the Philippines says that it is a part of its territory. However, it has issues with respect to China on this particular case. Then we have got the very important Parasail Islands. So do remember this. So we have got the Parasail Islands, right? Then we have got the Spratly Islands. Have a look. Then very important, the James Shoal. Over here we have got the Gulf of Thailand, right? So this is what you need to keep in mind, and so this map can become important for the prelims, right? And also what we need to keep in mind is that China has been sort of reclaiming different islands. It is building artificial islands where it is focusing upon the air defense systems, right? So that is where this South China Sea becomes important for the prelims exam. Next, we have got the issue of Azerbaijan. So we all know that there has been an issue with respect to a particular region in Azerbaijan known as the Nagorno-Karabakh region. So we have got a particular region in Azerbaijan known as Nagorno-Karabakh region. Now, this is primarily associated with ethnic Armenians, right? So you have got this country of Armenia, and there you have got Azerbaijan. Now, surrounding this is the Caspian Sea. So you can just have a look here. This is Caspian Sea, and this is Azerbaijan, and this is Armenia, right? So the countries surrounding the Caspian Sea are the Iran, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Azerbaijan, right? So do remember about this particular sort of country. Moreover, you need to keep in mind the Black Sea. So here you have got the Black Sea, right? So the countries surrounding the Black Sea are first Turkey, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. So just have a look. This might be important for the upcoming prelims. So that is it for today. I hope you like the session. Thank you so much.